Welcome to this month's seminar. This one is pre-recorded rather than live, and it's going out to all my paid members on YouTube and my Patreon subscribers. Okay, I've got a little bit of content to cover, and hopefully you're going to find some of this stuff useful. As always, just jot down any questions you have below the movie, and I'll try and get back to you as soon as possible. Now, just to give you an update on where I've or what I've been up to over the last month or so, is I've decided to go and make a Lightroom CC editing manual. Now, typically I will use Classic as my primary editing software, but when I'm out and about, it's also very tempting just to take an iPad Pro, or perhaps you'll be using another tablet, an Android tablet, but rather than taking the whole laptop. Obviously there's going to be a sort of a 1 kilo or more saving by making that decision. And if, like me, you're wanting to travel with messenger bags rather than backpacks as much as possible, it is quite tempting. And what's been happening over the last couple of years is Lightroom CC for the tablets has been coming on in leaps and bounds, and it's doing as pretty much as good a job now as the classic version. Okay, there are a few exceptions, there are a few things missing from that, but 95% of stuff I can typically get done using an iPad Pro. So as well as creating that downloadable ebook, there's 277 pages in that ebook, I decided rather than making one huge long movie to support that book, I would break it down into 9 shorter movies. This does have the advantage of me being able to title each one of the movies about what that particular 20-minute movie covers. And you can refer to the book if you don't want me talking at you for over 2 hours. Another one of my recent movies that I made was about the Finder and Monitor settings. In talking on the forums, I realized that quite a few people were not too sure about the touchpad settings, and also about the new tracking settings that came in when using the electronic viewfinder with the A7R4 and the A9 II cameras. So hopefully that movie will cover a few things that you may not have realized about some of the settings to do with that Finder and Monitor. I have been busy trying to update my current crop of ebooks as well. There is now an RX100 ebook, and I've also updated the A9 II ebook. Basically, I've added information about the A9 II to the original A9 book. I've just taken delivery of my own A9 II after borrowing it multiple times during 2019. I've also updated some information and added probably 30 or 40 pages to the A7 III and A7R3 ebook there, and I will continue to support that as long as those models are current. Basically what I'm doing now is I'm building up quite a catalogue of ebooks. As soon as I post the fact that I do have these ebooks, somebody will always say, do you have one for the A6500 or 6300? Somebody asked me if I had one for the A77. Really, I've only been generating these ebooks for just a couple of years now. I did backdate and do one for the A9 and also the A6000. Remember, the A6000 is Sony's top selling interchangeable lens alpha camera, so I did borrow one from Sony Australia just to make that available. But the 6300, 6500, they're both deleted models now from their range, and as much as I would like to backtrack and do older models, I really don't have the time to support each and every model. I have made a commitment to try and write an ebook for every new model moving forward. So if I haven't covered your current model, I'll probably cover your next model. The other thing that I'm getting a lot of questions on forums is they're asking a question which I have actually addressed in one of my movies, but because there's over 100 movies just supporting the alpha range of cameras, I do realize that maybe it's a little bit problematic to find the specific movie that will answer your question. So one of the ways to address that maybe is to just when you go to my YouTube channel, just hit the playlist option there, which is just alongside the community where some of you are accessing your paid membership question and answer forums there, and you will see that I'm trying to group movies together, there are about the same things, such as Lightroom, Photoshop, all of the A7R4 movies, all of the A9 movies, and I am putting those in little sets to make it easier to find. The difficulty of people finding the correct movie that will answer their question was also what prompted me to start writing those ebooks. The ebooks is basically a way of indexing all of the important movies, as well as adding tables and charts that might be helpful with visible settings there. The other thing that I've been busy, and you've probably noticed, is I'm working through a book that I had published about 12 years ago. I actually wrote about 30 books for Focal Press. Well, it wasn't about 30, it was 30 books for the international photography publisher Focal Press. The copyright rights reverted to me on this particular book called Digital Photography, Essential Skills. And I've been meaning to do this for a number of years now, but I'm going back in to those chapters and updating them. When I wrote the book, I was still addressing both analog technologies and very early digital technologies, and obviously things have come on in leaps and bounds, and mirrorless basically wasn't something that I was aware of when writing this book. So hopefully these chapters, updated chapters, are proving useful. They are in the vertical format rather than the horizontal format, which is what I'm normally doing when I'm writing ebooks now. But this should be okay for people who are wanting to read the PDF on, say, a tablet in the vertical orientation. The Patreon site has been coming on in leaps and bounds. We topped 100 patrons last month, and it's still climbing now. A few people are coming over from YouTube, and I do want to point out for some of my YouTube paid members, you're not getting anything extra from Patreon except for the fact that I am able often to reply to your comment just a little bit faster. YouTube don't give me a way to filter out questions or comments from my paid members, from just people just doing general likes and general questions. So I have to switch notifications off because of the 95,000 subscribers. I have to switch those notifications off, but I can leave notifications on for Patreon. Another slight advantage for me is Patreon take less commission from each person who subscribes, so that does help me out financially a little bit. You are welcome to join the $2 which is just questions. Obviously the $5 give you the Q&A forums and these seminars. A lens that I've recently taken possession of is the 20mm f1.8. Unfortunately, I'm probably not going to be able to do a review for a couple of months now, because I don't like just to sit in a studio, hold the lens, twizzle the focus barrel and say what I think about the lens. I do like to take it out on multiple shoots before I have an opinion that I feel justified in putting forward. And what I will probably do when I get around to it is making a comparison movie between the 24 1.4 GM and this 20mm f1.8 because I realize not everybody can afford to buy every prime and every telephoto zoom that Sony are releasing. It does come down to choices. That's how I set about making my review of the 200-600. Some people were a little bit critical that I kept mentioning the 100-400, and the reason I mentioned that lens over and over again is because a lot of people, most alpha photographers, would choose one or the other, not both. And some people at the end of a very extended movie would still say, so which one is the best? And that wasn't the purpose of the movie. It was to say they're both fine lenses. They just have they just meet different needs for different photographers. 100-400 portability, 200-600 reach, etc, etc. Now the interesting thing about this 20mm, getting back to this lens, is that it's not a GM. It now is the only prime lens that features an aperture selector on the barrel of the lens that wasn't designed by Zeiss or badged as a GM lens. So it looks, by all intents and purposes, the same build quality as the 24 GM lens. Some people picked up one review from the States talking about field curvature not being quite as good as on this 20mm, but I have to say you'd have to be really fussy to be picking up differences in field curvature, whereas the focal point isn't exactly the same distance depending on whether it's on the left side of the frame, the middle, or the right side of the frame. This I think is splitting hairs, really. I think the main decision for most photographers is either the 1.4 aperture for extreme low light capability handheld, or the extra wide angle of view on the 20mm. I have to say, once I've been using the 24 and the 20mm, I suspect I'll be going out with the 20mm more often. I do have that 24 covered by the 16-35 GM lens, the 24-105, but the 20mm is just a little bit wider than that 24-105, and it's obviously a lot more portable than the 16-35. Now I would probably like it to go a little bit wider still. I did have a Batis 18mm for a little while and I enjoyed traveling just with that prime. One of the reasons for that is because when I do take out the 16-35, 9 times out of 10 I'm shooting at 16. So the extra reach between the 24-35mm is a little bit wasted on me, to be honest, because I typically shoot landscapes very wide when I'm using a wide angle zoom. The other lens that I've decided to add, I borrowed it several times during 2019, was the 200-600. I toyed whether I could just get away with the 100-400 and 1.4 teleconverter, but I was so pleased with the second time I borrowed the 200-600 how reliable at focus tracking it was and how sharp it is wide open, that I decided I probably won't take it out as much as the 100-400, but as soon as maybe there's birds involved, I think that 200-600 is going to go in my small backpack with the A9 II, which I've also added now to my personal kit. I'm going to have to sell some gear. I can see that coming, especially as some of my income has dried up with this coronavirus and staying at home. Not a good time to be a public speaker, eh? Okay, so one of the things I picked up on the Petapixel forum, I don't monitor Petapixel very often actually, but I do see them bounced around Facebook when people are sharing them. And one that caught my attention and I thought I'd talk about for a little while during this seminar is this poor fellow in the United States who was outed by a famous pop star, Hilary Duff, basically, and she basically tweeted, "Go practice your photography on adults, creep." And what he was doing was he was trying out his new Nikon mirrorless camera by shooting the children playing soccer in the United States. Now he does actually have the right to do that. If he's in a public space like a public park, he is able to shoot pictures of people in a public space. So he didn't break any laws. People do not have the right to privacy in a public space. He didn't jump over a fence, he didn't go into a private park, and so he didn't actually break the law. But I have to say, people who do this type of photography, when they're pointing the camera at children, it is only a matter of time before you'll get some adults noticing that you're taking photographs of their children. Now, I do encourage people go out and take pictures of people. There's a lot of people who are a little bit timid and a little bit afraid of maybe pointing the camera at complete strangers, but nearly half of my photography as I build stories and narratives, they wouldn't be stories and narratives without the hero characters of that story, and so I do take pictures of people. I do have a sort of a sixth sense that when people are not going to want me to take their picture, and I don't invade their privacy by maybe using a 600mm focal length and hiding behind a wall to take their picture. I'm usually standing right in front of them. They're usually aware of my presence. I'm usually shooting with the 85mm prime. Sometimes now I am shooting with the 135, which does require me take a few steps back. So the couple of shots on the left, you can see that people are happily engaged with me. When I'm at a demonstration or a parade or a sporting event, or I've talked to people at work, and they're more than happy once I've told them who I am and I'm showing great interest in what they're doing, they're more than happy to let me take their photograph. And I'll take more than one. I'll take dozens of photographs if what they're continuing to do interests me. The image on the top left there is a child, and that child was sort of playing peekaboo at a demonstration with me. He was more than happy, and consequently, because he was playing peekaboo, I was taking more than one image, and I did get the look of an adult who started frowning at me, and I did have to justify what I was doing by basically telling them he's very happy. I'm just doing some media photography at this event, and I would stop if he wasn't happy. Just basically giving the adult some conversation to know that I wasn't a creep, basically. Okay, so one of the things that I'm just working on this morning actually is and something that I need to update an ebook. The great thing about ebooks is when they do go out of date, I can just go back in, update them and re-upload them to my website. When I was creating paper books, I would have to live with any mistakes or things that would go out of date for at least 18 months. Okay, so I used to just cross my fingers and hope that book would get a good shelf life. So one of the things that has become slightly out of date in one of my ebooks is the Lightroom Classic. There's a couple of pages, and it's only a couple of pages, that are dedicated to what's called default settings, or I should point out default raw settings. Now, it used to be quite a simple thing that in the develop module is to hold down the Alt key on a PC or the Option key on a Mac, and this would change to change default. And basically what you could do then is override the starting point, which is the Adobe default, with something that you would prefer to start editing your images with. So every time you then import images from that camera, it takes on these new default settings rather than have all of the sliders zeroed out and starting with Adobe Color as the default profile. So there was always a little bit of a worrying sentence in the old workflow, which was basically to warn people that these changes were not undoable, when in fact you could restore the Adobe defaults. You just had to go back into this panel and click Restore Adobe Defaults on the left side there. But it did worry people about that. So I often thought that they could probably improve this workflow. Now, Adobe have changed this workflow. Unfortunately, it's like 5 times more complicated than the workflow that I had previously described to people. So I thought I'd take the opportunity just to highlight that now if you are a Lightroom Classic user. So the thing to do is to take an unedited image, an image that you have not made any settings to. And the first thing that you probably want to do is decide what profile you would prefer to start your editing. A lot of people talk about the differences between what they see on the camera and what they see in maybe Capture One or Lightroom, but those defaults, especially in Lightroom, are not fixed. You could modify the default so the image looked exactly like it looked in Capture One and then make that your default. The fact that it's different in Capture One is just Capture One have made some different decisions about how to start editing an image. So rather than lock you into one starting point, Adobe didn't give you one alternative, they've given you hundreds of alternatives. Yes, it's very Adobe style, that is. don't change it to give you a look that looks more like the camera. Just give you dozens of different looks. So the first thing to do is to look in the develop module. Look right on the top and look for just below treatment. You'll see the word profile, and if you're running the current version of Lightroom, you will see Adobe Color as the default starting point. You can click on those four little squares though, which is your profile browser, and this will allow you to look at different starting points. Now Adobe will give you 7 of their own different starting points, something a bit more saturated, something a bit more flat, something a little bit more contrasty, something they call vivid, but they also give you camera matching profiles. Now this isn't available on every camera you use, but it is available on many cameras that you use. So just look for the camera matching. These are the sort of things that Sony might decide to do with the starting point of their images. So you can certainly look through some of these. Now a lot of people often say the raw starting point just always looks a little bit darker than they remember seeing on the camera, and one of the reasons for that is something called dynamic range optimizer, which lightens the shadows on camera, which can be on by default, is not being applied to the raw files. So shadows on a raw file typically look darker when we're opening them up in Lightroom. So if that is something that you want to overcome, you could, for instance, go over and click on light as your starting point, which will just open up the shadows a little bit more as your starting point. One of the things that you can also do, and look, it's one of my bugbears when I'm on forums, is people talking about color science. It's a phrase that Canon coined for how they use color on their cameras, and people will often say, oh, I prefer the skin tones on a Canon camera rather than the Sony camera. Tony Northrop did some blind testing on this, and when Canon owners were looking at Sony files, but they weren't listed as Sony files, they actually ended up preferring the skin tones on the Sony files, even though they thought that the Canon had the best colors. Now I always go, well, I've got a bit tired actually of going into these forums and just saying all of these colors are just flavors of colors that different manufacturers choose. They're not accurate colors, they're just flavors of colors. And if you wanted absolutely accurate color, you could use some color management hardware and software to actually measure the tones that are being recorded by your camera, and then the Adobe products are capable of shifting anything that's slightly off to something that is completely accurate. This is called ICC profiling, which I outline in my color management ebook that you can download from my website. The little device that makes these custom camera profiles that I prefer using is an X-Rite Color Passport, sometimes referred to as a color checker. These have been around for donkey's years. They even predate digital photography. We used to try and get the chemical or chemistry right in a lab by running what used to be then a Macbeth color checker, now owned by X-Rite. So you can actually measure the performance of your own camera and then install this in your Adobe software, whether it be Adobe Camera Raw, which is accessed through Bridge or Photoshop or through Lightroom. And you can even transfer these profiles over to Lightroom CC on the iPads and smartphones as well. Once you've made a profile with one of these devices, then you can pick it up in the profile browser under profiles, i.e. profiles that you've created. And so I would typically create a profile for each new camera that I take ownership of. It's a little bit expensive, these things. They're over $100, but I have always encouraged maybe a camera club or a group of friends to buy one and then basically profile all of the cameras you own. What you should do is, if you do find a particular one or two or three profiles you actually like using, then just click in the top right hand corner of that profile and it becomes a favorite. This means that you don't have to come into the profile browser again. You can access your favorites just by clicking next to the profile. A drop down menu will appear. You get the variations on the Adobe color profiles and the black and white profiles, but also anything that you've found in the profile browser that you've decided is one of your favorites. And if you just look at this particular slide, you'll see that I've just favorited black and white 05. I do actually like starting off a black and white conversion with one of the black and white profiles rather than starting with just the black and white Adobe default. Now, typically you could just set maybe this alternate profile as your new starting point, but I always think that it's probably worth just adding one or more settings as your default starting point. So for instance, you could decide to enable profile corrections if you're not doing that in camera. So there are some profiles that are actually, some color corrections that are actually done in camera. And what is happening in this particular lens corrections panel, it's noticing one of the profiles, one of the lens corrections is being embedded in the raw file. Some of the corrections are not embedded. So there's a little info icon. I've just clicked on that and opened it up to say the chromatic aberration is being corrected automatically off this camera lens combination. So, but one of the things that I typically always do is just enable profile corrections and also remove chromatic aberration. There is really no problem in just checking that box and having Adobe try to remove the chromatic aberration even though perhaps it's already been removed. So I would certainly invite you to go into that lens corrections and do that as well. So you don't have to come in with all of your images when you're importing. They'll automatically have the lens corrections applied. The next bunch of stuff that I typically will do to my own files, but you have to make a conscious decision whether you want to do this or not, because anything you do in the other panels will be applied to all files. So one of the things that I do on more than half of my images is just add a subtle vignette. You don't have to start with this, but this is my starting point. On the occasional maybe architectural image where I don't want that vignette, I would then have to come to the effects panel and take that vignette off. But because I add them to more than half, I've chosen this as a starting point. And I typically start use the color priority vignette and just a -15 there. The other things that I will do is I do like sharp images, and so the sharpening inside of Lightroom is a little bit more subtle than say in another program such as the Capture One program, which tends to double the sharpening compared to Lightroom. So I fall more towards Capture One's decision just to add a little bit more sharpening. So I would choose a starting point for sharpening instead of 40 and put that as 70 or 80. And one of the things that I wish Adobe would do by default is set that masking slider at least 50. What the masking slider does is it prevents sharpening happening in the smooth out of focus areas or the areas of smooth tone, maybe the complexion of a skin. Because if you sharpen everything, you sharpen the skin pores, you also sharpen any noise that might be present in your image, and just raising that masking slider prevents that from happening. So it's definitely something that I would want to do on all of my images. Even if you leave the sharpening at 40, I would still raise the masking slider to 70 as a starting point. Just remember, you can always work out which areas of the images are being sharpened or not just by holding down the Alt key on a PC or the Option key on a Mac and just moving that masking slider. Any areas of the image preview that turn black will not be sharpened. Any areas of the image preview that remain white are being sharpened. Once you've decided what it is that you're going to do, I'll just probably add I also use a negative highlights value and a positive shadows value and a little bit of extra contrast as my defaults as well. What you want to do then in the develop module is you want to come over to the presets panel and click on the plus icon, which is create preset. Now probably the good thing to start with here is go down to the bottom of this panel and click check none. You really want to make a conscious decision about what it is in that image that you've just adjusted that you need to be applied to every image from that camera now being imported. So if you've changed the profile from Adobe Color, you'll want to click that top box, which I'm pointing at with a red arrow, treatment and profile. Because I've changed some default settings on contrast, highlights and shadows, I've also checked those. I've checked the sharpening box. Sometimes I like to add a little bit of extra vibrance by default. You're probably aware I like colorful images when I'm not doing monochromatic images. So that plus 15 or plus 20 vibrance is put in as also a default setting. I've got that post-crop vignetting being applied there as well, and also the process version, which is the current version of Lightroom. So all of those are checked now. I'm confident that I want all of those applied to every image coming in from this camera, and then I'll give the preset a name. I've got to give it the name of the camera. Now you can just go into user presets, or you can create a new group. I've created a new group of presets called camera defaults, and I'll just put each of the preset that is dedicated to a specific camera into that camera defaults folder, and then I'll just hit the word create and that new preset is created. I did say it was a little bit more complicated, so here we're going into Lightroom's preferences now. Now you can leave the master at Adobe default. This is Adobe Color, but you do want to check that box just underneath that called use defaults specific to camera model. So if you create some new defaults, if that camera is recognized and there is a preset for that camera, instead of going and defaulting to Adobe Color, it will default to the preset that you've just made. So you want to click on the camera dialog there. If you've imported any images into your Lightroom catalog from different cameras, all of those cameras will be listed. So choose the camera that you've just created a preset for. In this case, I've just creating a preset for my A9 camera. Then just below it you've got default is the Adobe default. This is what we're going to change here because I don't want it to default to Adobe default anymore. So I'm going to go into that default drop down menu, choose preset, and then I'm going to come over to my camera defaults folder where I saved that new preset to, and I'll choose my Sony A9 default. Okay, what I'm going to do then is hit the button, create default, and you'll see that appears in the list of camera models on the right hand side. I would then go in and create one for my A7R4, my A6600. I might even create one for my little RX100 camera as well. So what happens now is every time you import images, the new images are always going to come in with that new default. One of the things I do recommend after you created that workflow and that preset and that new default is just test it out. Go to an image you haven't edited and go into the develop module and hit the reset button in the bottom right hand corner and just see whether all of those settings are now being applied. So if we look over to the basic panel there, you'll see a little bit of extra contrast, lower highlights, raised shadows, and you'll see the profile changes from Adobe Color to my A9 profile. So this does save quite a lot of work when I'm editing. Rather than editing each and every image, all of the images that I'm importing come through as partially cooked. So it's going to take me half the amount of time if I've already applied my sharpening and my vignette. And yes, I will want to crop and I'll want to do some other tasks to this image. Fine-tune the white balance, maybe fine-tune the exposure, but half of the work is already done. One of the things I wanted to do in this particular seminar is break away from camera settings, software settings, and maybe just look at when I'm posting images about camera settings and post-production settings. Invariably, a lot of people will pass comments on my images saying, wow, that's really good. Why don't my images look like that? We're using the same camera. So I just thought I'd backtrack through my recent folio of images. Some of these images you'll have seen before, but I just thought I'd talk a little bit about perhaps what makes this image or gives this image the wow factor. And maybe you can draw some advice from this and consider the next time you're either capturing an image or editing an image, you can maybe refer to one of these 7 points as would Mark have done that. Now I do want you to be your own photographer. I don't want you to copy my style of photography, but if you are looking at my images and you're going, wow, I really like Mark's images, then this is just a way of identifying maybe these are some of the things that you're actually liking about the work that I put out there. Okay, so let's go through some of this. I have taken a couple of screen grabs from things that I found on Facebook, so I have tried to blank out the names. I'm not trying to be overcritical here, but often I'm looking at an image going, would I have done that? And I found a couple of images where I've gone, no, I wouldn't have done that. I would have done something slightly different. So I will be showcasing those as well as my own. So the first wow thing, and there's 7 of these little pointers that I'm going to go through here quickly with some examples. This was captured with the A9 and the 400mm GM Prime. Great combination, but the other thing that makes this image for me is I've cropped it quite tight. You'll see that there is not a lot of space above the ears and below the trailing legs there, and we've got the water splash. A lot of drama. I like the color. There's quite a lot of things I like about this image, but we're going to start talking about crop, and you can either crop in camera or you can crop in post. Saw this image, somebody had gone to a racetrack that I've been to a few times and captured some image. Now technically it's very good, it's sharp, it's got some good motion blur, but I'm looking at the image going, yeah, there's quite a lot of negative space around the motorcycle. Would I have done that? And as I was looking at the image and I was thinking that exact thing, would I have done that? I tapped on the image in Facebook and pinch zoomed. And as I pinch zoomed, the image appeared to me as it appears on the right hand side. And I'm thinking, I may have done that instead. I actually quite like the horizontal lines of the grass and the backing and the Armco on the side of the track, but I'm thinking I want to make the motorcycle more powerful, more dominant in the frame, so I would have cropped tightly closer. I may have cropped tighter in a horizontal format, but in this instance I just pinched and zoomed, so it remained on the phone in this vertical format. So, and I would have perhaps done this with this image. Now I don't always crop tight. There is sometimes where I actually use negative space. That's the space around the subject, the primary focal point of the image. But I use it sparingly. I have to say most of my images I do crop quite tight, much tighter than most of the other images I'm seeing on social media. But there is an occasion where I am happy to zoom out or step back and provide the viewer with that negative space. And I'm doing that because the negative space is contributing to the composition and communication. In this particular image, the negative space or the lack of stuff happening around those 3 submerged trees or 4 submerged trees is void. It's basically saying these are lonely trees submerged in a vast expanse of water, and I can't really communicate the vast expanse of water unless I show you that it is a vast expanse of water. So this basically justifies why I don't want to crop tight on this particular image. Let's just shift the focus a little bit to one of my street style images here, and there is obviously some photographers who might want to crop really tight here, and I would have had the option to zoom in. I think this was captured with a 24-70 zoom lens, but at the wider focal length. Now I could have zoomed in, but what I noticed around is the big imposing Italian architecture at this train station in Madrid was actually contributing again to the communication, just as it did in the last image. So zooming out, getting the little pigeon, also looking at the guy with the newspaper, and having that empty space in this train station, for me, just helped add to the communication of these two people sitting on opposite sides of the bench in this big empty train station. Going back to those motorcycles, you can see I personally, and you probably looked at my MotoGP motorcycle images, and these aren't my images, but you probably see that what I'm cropping down to is more and more the style on the right hand side, because if I don't, I always think that the people will start trying to read the advert behind the motorcyclist, and that's exactly not what I want to happen. I want you just to focus on the guy getting his knee down in the bend, and with a little bit of drama going on. I took another shot from this same sequence of images. You always have to be wary when somebody asks me for photo critique, because I'll probably always find something to say, and you don't have to agree with it, but I am allowed my personal opinion, and if you value somebody else's opinion, sometimes it does open your eyes up to how other people might see your images. And as primarily a commercial photographer, it's of major importance that I actually understand how other people read my images, because predominantly I'm not trying to please myself with my own image making, especially when it's going to a magazine. It's there to be enjoyed by thousands of people. So I looked at this image on the left. It's that famous corner on the Phillip Island track called Siberia, and there is some reason to actually frame quite wide on this corner, because that blue area behind the motorcycles on the left is actually ocean. And so this is the only part of the track where you get a nice ocean view behind the motorcycles. So I can see why a photographer might zoom out a little bit, but again, I think I would have zoomed in. Now the other thing that I'm as well as zooming in, I'm also rotating, because that downward hill slope is just starting to get in the way of me creating the composition. As I rotate the image slightly clockwise, the motorcycles lean further over, which adds to the drama. We get a strong sense of drama through diagonal lines in an image. Diagonals always look unstable, which lends themselves to being dramatic. There was an old style of image called the Deutsch tilt, or it's the Dutch tilt, which is actually tilting the camera when things are not actually leaning over, in order to impose diagonal lines within your image, to give a sense of drama. So the other thing that happens as I frame tighter and the diagonals become more unstable is the motorcycle on the right gets closer and closer to the edge of the frame, and that builds some dynamic tension with the edge of the frame. So that is something that also can add drama into your images. How close am I prepared to crop? And I think you've probably seen me use this image previously to point out when I'm cropping an image, I am prepared to crop quite close. I've actually come down from a 42 megapixel image down to an 8.3 megapixel image here. I'm hitting the 4K dimensions exactly with this particular crop. Now I'm happy. If I'd been any further away from the dog, then I would be torn. Do I carry on cropping and going under 4K, or do I leave it at the 4K? Obviously, if you crop aggressively smaller than 3840 pixels on the width dimension, then if you are viewing it on a 4K screen, full screen, then the image will start to lose its sharpness as the device starts to scale your image up. So that is one of the factors that I'm often thinking about when cropping an image. I am prepared to crop aggressively, which is why I like the R cameras, is it does give me that ability to crop very aggressively in post-production. Here's another image that I captured with one of the R cameras. I don't need to crop aggressively in this image, but all of that stuff on the top of the frame. This is a lot of the street images that I shoot. I'm composing the background, and then I let people walk into my shot. But this is one of those rare exceptions where something happens, and I just grab one or two shots as quickly as I can, and so the framing leaves a little bit to desired. I wish I could go back in time and just give me a little bit of extra space at the bottom of the frame and cut out the extra image area on the top of the frame. So I have to do the best of what I've got. So my crop in post-production is this basically. This is a 4K crop, 16:9 aspect ratio, getting rid of all of that superfluous information at the top of the frame. And I really don't mind that the guy's hat is actually very, very close to the top of the frame. We've got very close to the bottom, which was sort of accidental, but I really don't mind getting close to the bottom. The other things that I like about this particular composition, there's not a lot to look at. It's quite a clean image, but the stuff other than the two men and the smoke is those steps. These diagonals give a little bit of sense of drama, and they also act as leading lines. It draws the eye through to the two areas of the image that we need to look at, and so that is more luck than good judgment, but we do find these things in post-production, things we didn't notice when we captured the image, and we go, oh, that was quite lucky that I didn't see that in capture, but I'm seeing it now in post, and that is making it a stronger image because I've noticed it. Cropping in very tight. This is a bird. Often I can't get close to the birds that I'm wanting to photograph, so I will crop in very, very tight. Obviously, the image will start to lose its power quite quickly the more sky I leave into this image. The other thing that might influence me when I'm cropping is to get a little bit of a diagonal. I could straighten the wings, because no one is to know how straight or crooked the bird is when they're flying in relationship to me. I'm certainly not going to be looking at the spirit line on the back of the camera when I'm framing this image. But when I am cropping in post-production, I can rotate the frame slightly to create a diagonal running through from maybe bottom left to top right, and I could do that even more on this particular image. I've let it go at this particular framing. Okay, so when I'm shooting sports action, I will allow the subject that's coming towards me to come in very, very close. The great thing about Sony's telephoto zoom lens is they have very close minimum focusing distances. The 200-600 doesn't quite compete with the 100-400 and 70-200 lenses, but the close focusing distance still allows you to get in very, very tight. And once we're tracking, or we've got lock-on working efficiently, we can follow that subject right through until the lens can't focus because the subject is simply too close. So again, this is at a very close focusing distance, and this is taken with a 135 prime, and I'll also value a lens that can focus very close if it's a prime, as well as a telephoto zoom. This is again a very tight crop on this barn owl. This was again captured with one of the R cameras that does allow me to crop aggressively down to the 4K output. When I'm cropping, I think one of the things I've noticed when I'm looking at other people's images on forums is a lot of people tend to zoom out, whereas I'm zooming in. I think there's a subliminal feeling that you must get everything in. So if you're taking a picture of the Queen Mary too, you must get the bow in and you must get the stern in. And I may have taken one image like that, but what happens, I'll get more foreground water, I'll get more sky, so the Queen Mary starts to look less impressive. I'm making the Queen Mary look impressive in this particular shot simply because it doesn't fit in the frame, and we have that sense of comparison between the Zamira, one of the support boats at Port Melbourne dock here, and the size of Queen Mary. So you don't always have to get everything in to make a shot, and sometimes you'll get a more powerful shot when you can't get everything in the frame. Another image to showcase that is maybe in Singapore here. This is one of the favorite hotels that I've stayed in Singapore. It's I forget the name of the hotel now, but if you look up Singapore hotels and vertical gardens, you'll probably get to this one. This is just the car park of the hotel, which is strewn with hanging gardens. And if I can frame this really tightly so we don't see any ground, we don't see any sky, you're just going to get this very powerful composition with simply two elements, concrete and vertical gardens. And sometimes the communication becomes stronger with the fewer elements we leave in a frame. Okay, so this is this goes back to a point I made earlier about the Dutch tilt. One of the other professional motorcycle photographers there, I noticed in his folio, he was, if not doing it in camera, he was certainly doing it in post. You'll notice that we have, there are some verticals, even though in the panning blur they're very blurred. You'll notice that there's probably 30 degrees or 40 degrees anti-clockwise tilt on this, and this allows me to make the motorcycle even larger in the frame without clipping the front wheel or back wheel, just squeezing the rear of the motorcycle in the top right hand corner and the wheel in the left, and that diagonal certainly gives a little bit more drama in one of these shots. I certainly wouldn't do it in every image, to be honest. You do use it sparingly because this technique can be overused, and I especially don't like it when used on, say, architecture or landscapes where there doesn't need to be drama by a Dutch tilt. The drama can come through your color, your weather, your composition, but doesn't have to necessarily come through this artificial tilt of the frame. One of the things that I notice in portraiture is this is definitely a reason for many people to stand back. I notice with a lot of amateur portraits, I generally nearly always see the top of the head, and with my tight portraits you very rarely see the top of the head. One of the things that you can see that I'm not breaking any new ground here. If you look at a Hollywood movie, this is the tight headshot of any Hollywood movie. As soon as one of the characters expresses some sort of dramatic the feelings or whatever inside the movie, or we need to see their expression at close range, the camera will come this tight, especially when they're using those ultra wide angle framings that they use in the Hollywood movies. You sort of are forced into cropping into the top of the head because they don't have the luxury of that 3:2 aspect ratio.